This video is going to be about a very specific argument for God, rather than responding to a video. This video is going to be about the ontological argument, or at least a specific version of the ontological argument known as the Gödel ontological argument, or some variation of it. I'm going to assume that you're already familiar with what an ontological argument is, or at least what the modal ontological argument is, but here's a clip of it.
Gotten onto the argument. And yeah, here is the modal ontological argument. Drum roll. No, okay. So here is the possibility premise. It's just got one premise, people. So it's easy to remember. Here's the possibility premise. Possibly God exists. Okay? Remember, this is metaphysical possibility. We are not just saying here that, oh, for all I know, God might exist, or things like that. And we're also not just saying, oh, well, it's at least consistent. It's consistent to suppose that God exists. There isn't some kind of logical contradiction in the statement God exists. It's not something like the cat is on the mat and it is not the case that the cat is on the mat. We're not making those sorts of claims. What we're claiming here is that it's metaphysically possible that God exists. And what that means, of course, given what I said earlier, is that there is some possible world, at least one possible world, wherein God does in fact exist in that world. So that's a possibility premise. And then from that, it follows that God exists, okay? It follows that God exists from, number one, the possibility premise, so possibly God exists, 2, S5, and 3, the definition of God. So remember the definition of God, right? God is a necessary being. And given S5, whatever is possibly necessary is just necessary. And here we say that possibly God, a necessary being, exists. So there's possibly a necessary being, in which case there is a necessary being. And of course, by that, the necessary being that we're talking about here is God, and hence God exists. So that is the argument. There's one premise, possibly God exists, and the conclusion follows from that possibility premise, from S5, and from the definition of God. So that's the argument.
The possibility premise is a modal ontological argument, but the modal ontological argument has a problem with it, as Majesty of Reason later points out in the video, which is that they suffer from a symmetry, because any justification you could give to the first premise of God possibly existing can also be used as justification for God possibly not existing. For example, say that we argue that God could possibly exist because we can conceive of him existing. Well, we could also conceive of God not existing, meaning this possibility premise wouldn't actually help the modal ontological argument one way or another. So we need something to break the symmetry and show that God's possible non-existence is less likely than God's possible existence. The Gödel ontological argument comes in. These ontological arguments are a different kind of ontological argument. However, they can be useful for breaking the symmetry between God's possible existence and God's possible non-existence. Ontological arguments are about perfection as a concept and how possible properties do not entail negative properties. There's a video I'm going to show that explains entailment as well as the argument.
All that matters is that when X is true, Y is true too. Here's a concrete example. Ice exists entails water exists. Every possible world wherein ice exists, water also exists. This is true even though there might be possible worlds where water exists, but there is nonetheless no ice. Maybe it's all boiling in that possible world. Using the same maneuver as earlier, this can be shown to be logically equivalent to the fact that there is no possible world that contains both the propositions ice exists and no water exists. There isn't any possible world like that. Now, here's a super important note. Entailment doesn't mean that there has to be any sort of logical connection between these two propositions. For example, ice exists entails 2 plus 2 equals 4. Why? Well, 2 plus 2 equals 4 in all possible worlds. So every possible world that contains ice exists also contains 2 plus 2 equals 4 automatically. Again, that could be rephrased as saying that there is no possible world where ice exists and 2 plus 2 isn't 4. Now, here's where we're going with all this entailment and vacuous truth stuff. Let's look at this statement. 2 plus 2 isn't 4 entails ice exists. Is this true or false? Well, that first part, 2 plus 2 isn't 4, is true in no possible world. It is necessarily false. But X entails Y when all worlds that contain X also contain Y. Since there are no possible worlds that contain x, namely 2 plus 2 isn't 4, then this statement is vacuously true. It's actually a true statement that 2 plus 2 isn't 4 entails ice exists, because there is no possible world where 2 plus 2 isn't 4 and ice does not exist. There isn't any possible world like that. So drill that into your head. Impossible things entail everything. If you understand that impossible things entail everything, then the rest of this argument is much easier to follow. Basically, Gödelian arguments will look at positive properties, or the property of perfection, or something like that. These are basically just a stand-in for God's properties, omniscience, omnipotence, necessary existence, and so on. Then the argument makes some claim about what the entailments of this property are. What exactly that claim will be varies from argument to argument, but one that I like is that perfection doesn't entail imperfection. Put another way, the proposition that a perfect being exists doesn't entail an imperfect being exists. Coolio. Now this principle directly guarantees the existence of God. And that's what looks like magic, but if you understand that impossible things entail everything, the logic is straightforward.
Since positive properties do not entail negative properties, and since perfection does not entail imperfection, if perfection was impossible, it would entail everything, including imperfection. Statement, all worlds where perfection exists entail imperfection, would be true if perfection was impossible. That would mean that perfection would in fact not be impossible, but be possible, as the video shows. Some have objected to this premise, saying that they don't see a problem with perfection entailing imperfection, because in order for that to be a contradiction, perfection would have to at least be possible first, meaning we're assuming perfection is possible, defeating the argument. I think this ignores a key position of the argument, given that entailment is usually always logically connected in some way, even if it doesn't look like it. For example, if I said cars exist in all worlds where there are not any square circles, that would be true, because in order for cars to exist, it would have to exist in some possible world, and since square circles cannot exist in any possible world, there is a direct connection between cars existing entailing no contradictions of square circles existing. This does not apply to perfection entailing imperfection, since there is no clear connection between those two things. And this would imply something like cars existing entails and perfection doesn't exist, which would be true if perfection was impossible, but it doesn't seem like the kind of entailment that I've already shown examples of. There doesn't really seem to be anything self-contradictory about it. This is an additional point unrelated to the Gödel ontological argument, but I also don't really think that the property of perfection is really impossible, since it doesn't self-contradict like most impossible things. Now, you could argue that perfection not existing or God not existing also doesn't self-contradict, but I would argue that's different, since you're talking about whether or not a certain being exists in the world rather than the property itself. So the property of perfection isn't self-defeating, but a world where perfection doesn't exist would imply that perfection was either impossible already to begin with. You could also make an argument about single properties of God. So I could say, it is possible that a being that is uncaused exists, and since a being that's uncaused would also have to be omnipotent and omniscient, according to the argument from limits, then that would also show that God existed, just based on a being that's uncaused being possible to exist.